rise it so that, you know, I mean, you don't want to milk it into some huge big thing. You know, I mean, I'd prefer you to be honest about it. You know,
George Harrison handed Eric Clapton a guitar in 1973 and said nothing. What followed wasn't a jam session. It was a duel. For 2 hours, they played without speaking, fighting over the same woman with music instead of fists. Everyone watching knew Eric had won. But the real scandal started 3 years earlier when Clapton confessed his obsession, and George caught his own wife in bed with someone even closer. The letters, the lies, and the legendary song Layla were just the beginning of a betrayal that split the Beatles' circle forever. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in a tiny house at 12 Arnold Grove in Liverpool. The place had no garden, just an outdoor toilet, and one small coal fire to keep warm. His father, Harold, worked as a bus conductor and used to be a steward on ships, while his mother, Louise, helped at a shop. Every Sunday, while pregnant, Louise would tune the radio to faraway music from India. She believed the sitars and tablas might calm the baby inside her. Years later, that same music would shape George's entire life. But back then, it was just a small sound playing softly in a freezing house in Wavertree. In January 1950, when George was nearly 7, the family moved to a council house. 6 years later, in 1956, his life changed forever when his mother bought him a used guitar for $3.10 shillings. That's about $110 today. It was a cheap Dutch-made Egmond acoustic. It didn't look special, but to George, it was everything. A family friend showed him how to play simple songs. That same guitar would later be worth over $800,000 when auctioned, even though it didn't have its original machine heads anymore. Around the same time, one afternoon, George was riding his bike through his neighborhood when he suddenly heard a voice like nothing he'd ever heard before. It was Elvis Presley singing Heartbreak Hotel from someone's radio. He was just 12 or 13, but he never forgot that moment. Some said he even crashed his bike. From that day on, he couldn't stop thinking about guitars. He drew them in his school books and said later, "I was totally into guitars." By March 1958, George made another big decision. He quit school at 16 and started working at Blackler's, a big department store in Liverpool. He was an apprentice electrician, learning how to wire things during the day, but at night he was practicing music with his band, the Rebels. It was like living two lives, one with tools and wires, the other with chords and dreams. That job didn't last long, but it gave him enough money to start buying better gear. In 1960, when George was just 17, he traveled with the Beatles to Hamburg, Germany. The clubs were rough, loud, and full of drunks, but George didn't care. There was only one problem. He was too young to be there. He had faked his age on his passport. On November 20th, 1960, a jealous club owner turned him in, and the next day, George was deported. He had just enough money to get home. One amplifier, one beat-up suitcase, and one guitar. But things started changing fast. On August 16th, 1962, Pete Best was suddenly fired from the Beatles. It happened at 10 a.m. in Brian Epstein's record shop. George, John, and Paul had already picked Ringo Starr to replace him, but didn't tell Pete until it was done. Just 10 weeks later, they recorded Love Me Do, and everything began to snowball. Pete Best missed it all by a matter of weeks. In August 1963, George was staying in a hotel room in Bournemouth, feeling sick and bored. While lying in bed, he picked up his tape recorder and wrote his first song. He called it Don't Bother Me. He later said it was just a test to see if he could write anything at all. That song made it onto the With the Beatles album on November 22nd, 1963. But after that, it would be nearly 2 years before they allowed another George song on a Beatles record. By 1964, things were spinning out of control. The Beatles were performing 32 shows in 24 cities across 33 days. Ringo got so sick, he collapsed with a 102-degree fever and had to be replaced temporarily. George wanted to cancel the tour, but their manager refused. George said later, the stress nearly pushed them all to a breakdown. Then something unexpected happened. On April 5th, 1965, while filming Help at Twickenham Studios, George saw a sitar for the first time. It was just sitting there in the background of a restaurant scene. A few months later, on August 25th, David Crosby from The Byrds told him about Ravi Shankar. George went back to London, bought a sitar, and started experimenting. In October 1965, he used it on Norwegian Wood. It was the first time anyone had used a sitar in Western pop music. Ravi Shankar didn't like George's playing at first, but it didn't matter. A whole new sound had just been born. By 1966, George felt left out. Lennon and and McCartney wrote most of the songs. During the Revolver sessions, George started pushing back. His growing interest in Indian philosophy and his use of LSD made him feel even more distant from the others. Things got worse by January 10th, 1969. While filming the Get Back sessions, George suddenly said, "I'm leaving the band," and walked out. He stayed away for 5 days. He later said he was tired of Paul's bossy attitude and didn't even recognize John anymore, who was lost in heroin. That moment nearly ended the Beatles. Meanwhile, Eric Clapton was living a completely different childhood. He was born on March 30th, 1945, in Surrey. His mother, Patricia, was only 16. His father, Edward Fryer, was a Canadian soldier who left before Eric was born and never came back. To hide the shame, Eric was raised thinking his grandmother was his mother, and his real mother was just an older sister. He only found out the truth when he was 9, and it broke him. He stopped caring about school and started pulling away from everyone. For his 13th birthday in 1958, Eric got a cheap Hoyer guitar with steel strings. It was hard to play. He gave up within months and got obsessed with cycling instead. But by age 15, he returned to the guitar, this time with a passion that didn't stop. He bought a K guitar, which looked like a Gibson, and practiced for hours every day. He would record himself on a reel-to-reel tape machine, then listen again and again until he got it right. Guitar was all he cared about. In 1961, he got expelled from Kingston College of Art after just 1 year because he didn't turn in any schoolwork. He had spent all his time playing guitar. In January 1963, at age 17, Eric joined a blues group called the Roosters. They didn't play many gigs, but they rehearsed constantly in small London pubs. By August, they broke up. It was only 6 months, but it taught Eric how messy band life could be. Later that year, in October, Eric joined the Yardbirds. He was only 18. In March 1965, they released For Your Love, which hit #1, but Eric hated it. He felt like the band was selling out. On March 13th, just before the single hit the charts, he quit. He called it a betrayal of real blues. In an interview that year, he admitted he regretted walking away from the money, but not the music. During those 2 years with the Yardbirds, Eric was falling apart inside. He felt alone, even when surrounded by people. The non-stop touring drained him. He ate little, drank too much, and felt invisible. One night, he thought he was losing his mind. He called his best friend, but the phone line was bad. His friend couldn't hear him. Eric thought even his only friend had turned on him. That moment pushed him over the edge. He had to get out, so he left the Yardbirds, even though it meant walking away from fame and money. In 1966, something explosive happened in London's rock scene. 3 powerful musicians, Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker, joined forces to form Cream. People were calling them rock's first supergroup, but behind all the excitement, something dark was already bubbling. Clapton had no idea that Bruce and Baker had a violent past. Years earlier, when they played in the Graham Bond organization, they didn't just argue, they fought. One night, Baker attacked Bruce during a drum solo just because he thought he was playing too loud. Baker later said, "I nearly killed him. A bouncer had to pull me off. It got worse." At one point, Baker even pulled a knife on Bruce when he tried stepping on stage. Their hatred was so deep that when Bruce was dying in 2014, he picked up the phone and said to Baker, "I'm dying, Ginger. Fuck you." Then hung up. Despite that chaos, in 1967, they released Disraeli Gears, which had Sunshine of Your Love. That song made Clapton a legend, but success was a curse. Clapton, already exhausted from non-stop touring, started using heroin just to cope. Over time, the addiction took everything from him: his health, his peace, his money. At one point, he was spending the equivalent of $8,000 a week just on heroin. In 1982, it all caught up with him. He collapsed in Minneapolis with 3 bleeding ulcers from mixing 3 bottles of brandy with piles of codeine every day. He later said, "I was running on empty. I don't know how I survived the 70s. By 1968, it all fell apart." Their farewell tour was nothing short of toxic. Clapton was trapped between Bruce and Baker's constant fights. They played 6 nights a week. Clapton stopped eating properly. He got so thin, he was just 9 stone and looked like he was wasting away. He begged their manager, Robert Stigwood, "Get me out of here. These guys are crazy." One day in Copenhagen, during a film shoot, Clapton broke down crying because of all the yelling between Bruce and Baker. On stage, their shows turned into shouting contests through instruments, each of them trying to solo louder and longer than the other. Even though people called him God because of how he played on Crossroads, Clapton felt like a fraud. When Hendrix arrived in 1967, it wrecked him. Clapton couldn't handle how good Hendrix was. At first, he told people Hendrix was just a hype, but later he admitted Hendrix could play on his own and do it perfectly. The pressure to live up to his God label made Clapton play harder, faster, more aggressive, and pushed him deeper into addiction. Then came the money disaster. Even though Cream was making millions, none of them saw much of it. Manager Robert Stigwood ran them into the ground. He kept booking tours without giving them breaks or time to write. Jack Bruce said, "We were very unfortunate to have Stigwood. They begged him for $40,000 to upgrade their sound equipment, and he refused." Bruce walked out. They had to drag him back to the stage. By the time the band ended in 1968, they were all broke and angry. Clapton had nothing left, emotionally or financially. That mess set the stage for his next group, Blind Faith, and even deeper drug problems. But something changed in September 1968. George Harrison invited Clapton to Abbey Road Studios to record While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Harrison knew that if Clapton was there, the other Beatles wouldn't criticize the song. Clapton said, "Nobody ever plays on Beatles records," but Harrison handed him a bottle of wine and said, "You will." Clapton used George's Les Paul guitar and ran it through a Leslie speaker to get that swirling tone. McCartney had hated the song before, but once Clapton finished his solo, he called it brilliant. Clapton's hands were shaking. He got paid just $50. He never cashed the check. That session created a bond between them. So in December 1969, Clapton joined George on the Delaney and Bonnie tour. Harrison played rhythm, Clapton played lead, and the nights were wild. They stayed at the London Hilton, drinking Blue Label vodka until 4 in the morning. They played 23 shows across England and Scandinavia. On December 15th in Liverpool, both were so high they didn't even realize their guitars were tuned differently. It still sounded magical. Harrison later said he learned more about the blues in those 3 weeks than during his entire time with the Beatles. The tour ended on December 17th in Copenhagen. Harrison and Clapton played a 20-minute version of Roll Over Beethoven that left 3,000 fans speechless. Tour records showed they spent over $15,000 just on drugs. That's around $120,000 today. Then came the guitar swap. On March 15th, 1970, inside Harrison's Friar Park studio, George handed Clapton his 1957 Les Paul. Clapton gave him Brownie, his 1956 Strat. They played each other's guitars for 47 minutes. Engineer Phil McDonald said it felt like musical telepathy. But then Pattie Boyd walked in. Clapton saw her in a flowing white dress and completely lost focus. He fumbled his solo. Harrison, unaware of the tension, asked her to stay. Clapton's playing turned raw, emotional, almost painful. The cameras caught him looking at her 17 times during one take. Harrison didn't see it, but everyone else in the room felt it. From May to October 1970, Clapton played on 11 of the 23 tracks on All Things Must Pass. He got paid $2,000 per session, but he wasn't there for the money. On June 3rd at 2 a.m., he recorded I'd Have You Anytime in a single take, tears in his eyes. During the My Sweet Lord sessions, he asked for 14 takes, not because the music needed it, but because Pattie was in the room and he wanted to impress her. On August 12th, while recording Art of Dying, he played a solo so intense Harrison stopped the session and asked, "Are you okay?" Clapton answered, "Just thinking about death, mate." But deep down, he was grieving the friendship he was about to ruin. By August 1st, 1971, things hit rock bottom. Harrison had planned the concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Garden. Clapton was supposed to play. He even showed up to 3 rehearsals. But 48 hours before the show, Clapton overdosed. His roadie found him at 6 a.m., unconscious with foam coming out of his mouth. Harrison waited until 7:30 p.m. on the day of the concert before accepting he wasn't coming. During the song, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, cameras caught Harrison looking toward the wings, waiting. When Clapton never came out, you could see him deflate. Leon Russell played the solo. The show raised $243,418, but Harrison later said losing Clapton to drugs hurt more than any Beatles breakup. They wouldn't speak for 7 years. And behind it all, Harrison's marriage was crumbling. He married Pattie Boyd in January 1966. By February 1968, during their trip to India with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, he was already cheating on her. He told her later he wanted an open relationship. Boyd had introduced him to meditation in 1967, and now he was using that same spirituality to cover up betrayal. She felt crushed. Things got worse in 1971. Harrison released My Sweet Lord, which became a global hit, but it also triggered a lawsuit that dragged on for 22 years. On February 10, 1971, Bright Tunes sued him, saying he stole the melody from the Chiffons' 1963 hit, He's So Fine. In 1976, the court said he was guilty of subconscious plagiarism. He had to pay $1,599,987, over $8 million in today's money. He later said, I've never had any money from the song. It's always been in escrow. It nearly broke him. In 1973, the hypocrisy got louder. Harrison released Living in the Material World, talking about Krishna and detachment. But behind the scenes, he was doing cocaine, drinking heavily, and cheating. Pattie said he would meditate all day for months, then suddenly stop, snort coke, party, and flirt. Klaus Vormann said Harrison got very heavily into drugs. He couldn't live up to the image he created. Then came the 1974 disaster tour. Harrison had laryngitis, but still did 45 shows across North America. His voice was shot. He rewrote Beatles lyrics to talk about God. People walked out during Ravi Shankar's segments. Critics destroyed him. At the last show, Harrison told the crowd, see you in 8 years, and vanished. It all started in 1970 at a quiet house party at George Harrison's home. Eric Clapton, who was just 25 at the time, walked up to his best friend and said something that froze the whole room. He looked George in the eye and said, I have to tell you, man, I'm in love with your wife. Pattie Boyd, George's wife, was standing right there. She had no idea this was coming. No idea that Clapton's friendly visits weren't just friendly. George, who had been married to her since 1966, was furious. Right then, he turned to Pattie and told her to choose. She stood in shock. She had no idea Clapton had been secretly in love with her for over a year. That one sentence from Eric didn't just break the silence, it broke everything that had been holding them together. Even after all that, Pattie chose to stay with George. She rejected Eric's confession in 1971, thinking it was just a moment, but it didn't end there. Eric kept writing her letters, calling her Layla, and pouring out his feelings. He told her, if you want me, take me. If not, break the spell that binds me. But Pattie stayed loyal, even while her marriage to George was quietly falling apart. Then, in December 1973, everything collapsed. She went to visit Ringo Starr's home and walked in on something she could never forget. George was in bed with Ringo's wife, Maureen. Not only had he been cheating, but he had told Ringo he was in love with Maureen. The betrayal wasn't just between husband and wife. It split the Beatles' circle in two. John Lennon called it virtual incest. Ringo threatened divorce. And Pattie, who had turned away from Eric so many times to stay loyal to George, now found herself completely broken. In 1974, the quiet affair between Eric and Pattie finally began. George had no idea. Eric would come over when George was out of town. They kept it secret, meeting in London hotels and sneaking away to Clapton's estate in Surrey. Things got serious when Eric invited Pattie to join him on his 1974 U.S. tour. They stopped hiding. Pattie later admitted they barely even tried to keep it a secret by the middle of that year. The whole thing was made worse by the fact that George and Eric had been incredibly close. George had invited Eric into his home countless times. Eric was like family. George didn't explode in public. Instead, he picked up his guitar. In late 1973, just months before Pattie left him, George recorded the song So Sad. He had started writing it in 1972 in a New York hotel room. It was cold, bitter, and full of loneliness. Nothing like the songs he used to write with the Beatles. He later said the song was depressing because that's exactly how he felt. Music was the only place where he could speak freely. He poured all the heartbreak into those lyrics. One critic later said it sounded like George's spiritual beliefs had died with his marriage. That same year, at Friar Park, something happened that would go down in rock history. After George finally found out about the affair, he didn't scream. He didn't punch anyone. He handed Eric a guitar. Pattie said it was like watching two 18th century gentlemen duel with swords, but instead of blades, they used guitars. For 2 hours, they played without saying a word. John Hurt, the actor, watched the whole thing. He said it was like theater. Eric stayed calm, playing with emotion, but control. George, on the other hand, played louder and more aggressively, trying to outshine Eric, but only showing his desperation. When it was over, nobody declared a winner. But Pattie later said everyone knew Eric had won. Not because he played faster, but because he didn't lose control. That guitar duel didn't come out of nowhere. It all traced back to that shocking moment in 1970 when Eric said, "I'm in love with your wife." Pattie remembered how George turned red with anger and demanded she choose on the spot. They had been married for 6 years at that point, but George had already had multiple affairs. Still, Pattie stayed, but Eric didn't stop. He wrote her letters saying, "My love is yours," and even said he'd give up everything just to be with her, his family, his faith, his life. From 1970 to 1974, Pattie lived in confusion. She loved George, but Eric's obsession had become overwhelming. When he wrote the song Layla, it changed everything. Pattie said the passion in that song broke her. She couldn't resist anymore. All this time, George had been cheating on her too, most notably with Charlotte Martin, who happened to be Clapton's girlfriend. It became a tangled mess. When George confronted Pattie about her relationship with Eric, he admitted to his own affairs. By then, Pattie said she and George had already been living separate lives. By the end of 1974, it was over. George and Pattie separated. Their divorce was finalized in 1977, but the friendship between George and Eric was already broken. They didn't speak for years. No more jam sessions, no more laughter. Eric and Pattie moved in together as soon as she left George. In 1979, they got married. George actually showed up to the wedding. He even joked that he and Eric were now husbands-in-law. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr were there too. That night, the three Beatles even jammed with Eric and other rock legends. It was awkward, but George handled it with his usual grace. He once said, "I'd rather she was with him than some dope," but the marriage didn't last. Pattie and Eric's love story turned into something darker. Eric's drinking became worse. He was violent, unpredictable, and constantly cheating. The worst blow came in 1986 when he had a child with Italian actress Lori Del Santo while still married to Pattie. She couldn't take it anymore. They separated in 1987 and divorced in 1989. Pattie later said the whole relationship became a nightmare. She lived in fear, never knowing which version of Eric would come home. Despite everything, George and Eric eventually worked together again. In 1987, George released Cloud 9 after years away from music. Eric played lead guitar on several tracks. It was a professional project, but people close to them said the tension never fully left. They worked side by side, but it wasn't like the old days. Still, the album did well. The song Got My Mind Set on You became a hit, and fans were happy to see the two on good terms again, even if they were only pretending. Then in 2001, George passed away from cancer. Eric organized the concert for George a year later at the Royal Albert Hall. He brought together Paul, Ringo, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, and many more. But the most emotional moment came when Eric played While My Guitar Gently Weeps. That was the same song he played for George and the Beatles back in 1968. Now, it was a tribute. He could barely hold back the emotion. People backstage said he finally let the guilt come through. That concert helped him heal. After everything, the love triangle, the betrayal, the silence, he said he finally made peace with George.